Welcome to this episode of Video Learning Lab, where we teach you to create impactful learning and communicate better with video. We're excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Dawn Diperi, who is a learning designer and graphic designer with extensive experience in the field of education. She has worked for various organizations, including the Harvard Graduate School of Education, UNICEF Learning Passport program, and is an internationally recognized expert in online pedagogy, inclusive classrooms, and accessibility. Dawn's work focuses on providing continuous education to children and adults who've been displaced by war, violence, and climate disasters. In fact, Dawn, I know that you are fresh off a mission just last week, so very grateful that you can take the time to talk to our audience. So welcome, Dawn. It's great to see you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I really
Ab-
appreciate it. It's fun to be here.
Absolutely. So to start off, I want to say I use your graphic design for Course Creators book often as a reference, and I'm including that in our notes below. So if you're listening right off the bat, please go and check that out. So I'm very excited to chat with you, especially today. I'm also excited because I know we both started out in the classroom and face-to-face teaching, and then moved more into e-learning and online instruction. So I wanted to start there. I'm curious, what was your journey getting started and when did you become passionate about e-learning and instructional design?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a former educator. I'll always be an educator in my heart. I just will probably never not identify as an educator. But
Mm,
prior to being an educator, many years ago, I started off as a graphic designer, and I worked in advertising and publishing and web design and all of that. But I worked for many types of organizations. So I got into education. I started teaching college graphic design courses like animation, a lot of software. Eventually, I started teaching future teachers educational technology. And I think that's part of when I started to get into instructional design, because I really was kind of teaching instructional design, even though I might
mhm.
not have realized that that's what it was. It was called like new media. And then I started teaching more and more hybrid and eventually online. And my experience teaching there, because I had the graphic design experience, like the user experience background, I was not super excited about the look and feel, the navigation of the course. Felt like there were some barriers there that I didn't feel like it was effective, I guess I could say, the way that it was created or structured as my face-to-face experiences. So it made me like kind of reevaluate as an instructor, like it's, I can't blame the platform all the time, but I bet there is ways that I can improve it. But what else can I do personally as an instructor to get that engagement and get that motivation and to get the spark of online learning, or as they say. So I went back and I got my doctorate in higher education teaching and learning, which is like kind of half instructional design and like half change management, like organizational psychology kind of thing, but focused on education. Moved into the humanitarian sector. So I really took a pivot there because I left all of those years of being in academia for the humanitarian sector. And I work with I help to train or do faculty development with other coworkers, and I also do teacher professional development and a lot of software stuff. So I work in like a lot of different fun software, training, webinars, tutorials, stuff like that. So it's been an interesting
I
journey.
feel like, like you said, you've had a lot of experience, but also you kind of, it seems like in your career, you've kind of bounced back and forth between communicating to people through digital media, whether that's in advertising or through e-learning courses, then back into the classroom, then back into communicating to people through video and instructional design courses, and now you're back on the human side of things. But I know that you've certainly shared your learnings along the way as you've gone through both. So I think that it's unavoidable. It sounds like you miss working with people, and then maybe you get a little bit tired of people, or the opportunities come to work in digital media. So I
Yeah.
definitely see the movement between those two there. I'm curious because I read that when you were designing online learning courses, and you just mentioned it yourself that you didn't have kind of that spark, or you felt like you didn't have that spark or that engagement or that presence or that maybe
Yeah.
teaching
The
that love of
instructor
learning. Yeah,
presence.
the
I
instructor
wanted to learn how
presence.
to improve that. Yep. Because it felt
Yeah.
like a cold environment.
Hmm.
And like now I know that online learning is not inferior to
Hmm.
face to face. In fact, in many ways, it's better. So, for example, like today we're talking about digital accessibility and inclusion, right? So
Hmm.
sometimes in online learning, we can actually increase motivation and engagement and actually increase access more than maybe even face to face. So, like, I didn't know that many years ago. And like, it makes me so excited that online learning or digital learning can do that. Like I would have students in my face-to-face class and I would say, wow, they're really engaged, they're super motivated. But then like in retrospect, I think back, it was like always like the same five people or so that would like raise their hand or participate in discussion. And sometimes I had a hard time as an instructor getting to everybody, right? But in online learning, we can actually create the experience to meet all of their needs so that we can deliver the information in multiple formats so that whatever is their preference and that addresses the learner variability, then we know that the learner is going to be more likely to be engaged. And plus we know that sometimes on in for me, like I'm an introvert, but I'm way more participatory and like say like a webinar where I like to like type my answers, versus like if I was in class, like raising my hand as much, So I find that we can actually get more participation sometimes in the online space. So it's really interesting.
We certainly have I think, especially now compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago, we have more interactivity or more options for formats, and we're able to accommodate user and learner choice in our learning designs and in our learning program. What are some of the big changes that you've seen as far as accommodating user choice or more of a universal learning experience?
I'm a big fan of universal design for learning. So yeah, I heard you say the word universal, and like I really love that you can present information, present materials in multiple formats, and you can also help learners show what they know in multiple ways. I think when you're first starting as an educator, and I'm sure anyone who's listening today that is an educator would resonate with this, but you kind of feel like you just follow the books. You're just like, oh, here's the syllabus they gave me. This is what I need to cover. And you just kind of like, I don't want to say like you're a robot, but you're just sort of like, you're afraid to like stray the course. But then you realize like, hey, I can make this more effective. And like through my journey, I've realized that I can stray a little bit from that and like sure it may be a little bit more work to say okay, you can submit either an oral presentation or an essay or some kind of like collage, right? So here's just an
Sure.
example of
Hmm.
like these three assignments where I might not have done that in the past because it would be more work. It's like you're still like going to have the same expectations of proficiency, but now I'm more confident in a learning as a learning designer, and I became more confident as an educator as I learned more about learning theory and more about universal design for learning. Like in the end, that benefits them. And what do we want more than anything? To be an effective educator, right? To be effective at designing learning experiences. In order to do that, you sometimes have to be flexible and adapt and try different things so that we accommodate everyone.
I think something that resonated with me that you just talked about was assessment. And I know
Yeah.
that when I was a classroom teacher, I mean, even teaching kindergarten and first grade, there are very few options for how we assess, is the learning sticking, what outcomes are we seeing, and often it was in the form of a written assessment. Something that I see
Yeah.
also in the L&D world and on the training world is that the set of we're looking for a set of targeted behaviors, but our scope is
Yeah.
so limited in terms of how a learner can demonstrate that learning or what behaviors they're showing. And so it's a frustration that I haven't overcome, and I don't quite have the solution, but I think I do see experiences outside of learning when it comes to digital media, how many ways there are to communicate what you know, whether that's through video or other formats that I've been trying to push onto the L&D and training community, but I think it's still very much in the air about how we assess because historically we've struggled with measurement in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm always harping on when I talk to people who are creating learning or just trying to train people is like, we need to move away from all of these high stake standardized tests
Mm,
because they're not good for a learner. They cause like anxiety and stress. There's like proof that it's not equitable. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate aptitude in the future or future success. It's just like, I understand in some cases you might have a certificate or some kind of like formal education system where the government says you have to pass this whatever test to move to the next level, but we don't want to rely on that. We don't want to rely on like filling in the bubbles like the multiple choice all the time. So I'm such a huge fan of formative assessment because it's just like a low stakes way to show what you know. It's like check for understanding. And I'm also a huge fan of simulations and scenario based learning because like when we're talking about all learners, but adults in particular, like we want them to apply what we're teaching them and think of it in like with critical thinking and to put themselves in situations that they may have to encounter and like make decisions based on like what we're teaching them. So in like a safe environment, this is a low stakes situation, right? Like or we're able to go through simulations and diagnose a patient, right? But like you're not going to like kill them because it's just a simulation, but it makes you think and helps you with critical thinking and apply that the application of the learning, so I love implementing anything having to do with scenarios and simulations and so forth as much as possible whenever we can.
hmm Yeah, it's interesting because our previous guest was a game designer who works in corporate L&D as well, and he was talking about how rarely do we get opportunities as adults to fail on the job and not have there
Yeah.
be any consequence. And so learning experiences provide that opportunity to fail and kind of assess, the way that you make decisions, is that working? Is that, that's the performance that I think is truly, it should be measured. We're talking about designing for universally for learners, and a lot of that is about designing with accessibility in mind. And I think for me, accessibility in my instructional design program, it was covered, but it wasn't emphasized. And I think it was messaged that it's a requirement by ADA standards to have some basic things like captions and metadata for photos and online learning content. But when I started creating e-learning, it was something that was kind of like a checklist, like something to check off at the end of my developmental process
Mm.
to make sure that I crossed my T's and dotted my I's. But I've learned designing more learning, that's really a misconception about e-learning, and that there's definitely more that we can do. What are some of the big misconceptions that you see or hear about designing accessibility into learning experiences?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your experience because I think a lot of people have like gone through similar situations.
Hmm
And I feel like accessibility is really it's kind of having its time in the sun, or as they say right now, like it's really becoming more and more important. And there's a lot of people talking about it, which is a great thing. And I think I like how you talked about how we really have to design in the beginning, because with my book, even though it like at first appearance, it may think it's a graphic design book, it's actually the very first half of the book is all about accessibility. And it's about considering that first. So before we talk about like the way things look and feel, first we want to make sure that is it accessible, and we want to design that into the plan before we even begin, because there's a misconception that like, oh, to be accessible is expensive, it takes up too much time, I don't want to bother with that, it feels overwhelming, right? So that's because I think in the past people just designed and like didn't consider it, and then at the end went back and go like, oh, we might get sued, so let's go check this. And we just realized it's not accessible and now we need to fix it. So yeah, at that stage, it's more expensive. It's more of a hassle. So thinking about it in the beginning is more important than looking at it at the end. Of course, there's also reviewing it at the end. I don't want to leave that out because we want to make sure that we've captured everything, and we want to have one misconception is like, hey, we did it and we're done and we're going to move on. I don't think of accessibility as like a checklist. I think of it as like, these are best practices, but we are always constantly having to reflect, design with learners at the beginning, making sure that we're using like, say, blind accessibility learners that are checking things with screen readers, that we're interviewing learners, asking what their preferences are. We're designing more and more products with customizability, which in my opinion is the way I think products should go, so that we have the option to shut off the captions or leave them on, put the volume up high or not, skip ahead or not, change the contrast or not, or so forth, because there's so much variability. So it's not, you have like the recommendations, WCAG, 2.2 is now coming out. Those we should consider, but we also want to think of, if you're a product designer, thinking in terms of like, what can we do that is customizable, so that we could really fine tune that experience for that full learner variability.
What is the opportunity, or what is the ROI on designing with accessibility of the design process?
I'm not sure that's my expertise at all, but I just feel like it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We're not using, like, we're not being ableist or sexist or racist, that we're being inclusive in our language and our imagery, that we're being accessible in terms of like, what we're doing is saying, you all belong here, like you have a right to this content, and you should feel like it resonates with you, and making conscious decisions to do that, to because otherwise, what's the return on investment? I guess you may have employees that quit if you're not, like that then it's cost of getting more people to be onboarded. I mean, it's also low morale. I mean, there's lots of reasons for organizations to consider accessibility.
Yeah.
You're also going to lose a huge market share, right? If you're talking about like your website and being accessible for your customers, if you're not, you're going, people who have disabilities that are going to come to your website, if they can't access the information, they're going to go to a different place. So there's your reason, if you're going to look at it from a cost model. I don't, I guess, always operate that way. I think of more of like an altruistic way of thinking of things, but you're right. It is a business decision too. And it has implications if you don't consider accessibility and inclusion.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the something that accessibility really does address when you're talking about inclusivity, and is more the learner experience when they're taking these courses. I think a lot of e-learning, when it's rushed, or the design is kind of, when you're designing one for many, is that learner experience of feeling alone, and not being.
When we look at e-learning from a post-pandemic world, we're migrating more away from like the MOOCs, like those massive open online courses that are purely asynchronous, and moving towards more of a blended model, because we see that MOOCs have a lower completion rate overall, and they cite that it's because there's that feeling of coldness, or we might call like transactional distance, or that feeling of connection between the instructor and the student to the other student, and the student to the content. If we don't have that feeling of like warmth or closeness, then we're less likely to complete the course, as you say. So the cool thing is there's so many like technological tools now that we can implement for peer-to-peer learning and collaborative learning, and ways for the instructor to interact in ways beyond just like a face-to-face lecture style format, right? So we have like very simple tools like Padlet, for example, right? So you can post questions on there, and you can see other people respond, and you can reply, and it's very like low bandwidth type of program. It's the free option gives you like 3 or 4 boards. It's very easy to teach. It's easy to embed. So that's an example. And there's lots of other tools too, but trying to creatively think of ways to improve that feeling of connection and lower that feeling of coldness, I think is obviously key for success.
I know that in your book that you had, one of the original you talked about one of the original motivators for learning, being passionate about instructional design was uh, finding a way to make your course more engaging. And I think this is really $1 million topic for e-learning. And so, if you're an instructional designer, let's say you've done your thorough audience analysis, you have your instructional plan for organizing, chunking, and sequencing your content,
Yeah.
and you're moving
Yeah.
into development. How do you approach constructing your learning experiences? What are some of the major considerations that you have for designing e-learning and the tools that you go to? How does that work in your world?
Like I have to create content and present content in many different languages sometimes.
Mm.
So for example, like when I'm choosing a tool, like sometimes it comes down to like, what does this tool do? Is there another tool that can also do it? Is there another tool that can do it better? What is the cost of the tool? Is it interoperable? Is it like, meaning, can it integrate with whatever learning management system that you're using? Is it easy to teach and learn if others are going to be using it? Does it have accessible features? Like, so when you're thinking about like what tool to use, those questions all come in mind. And I love, like, for example, I love your tool just because it suits a very specific need. Not all tools out there can accommodate different languages. And I really like that you can select many different types of avatars, and you could use many different languages and even different dialects. And we can even program like human-like qualities into a more synthetic media, like the how you created like pausing and winking and all of those things that just like help make it feel a little bit less cold, like when we're looking
Mm.
at Myers theories and stuff, people will respond better to humans than to avatars, but like, or to robots. But I think that the way that the technology is moving, things are becoming more and more human like, to the point where now we're thinking of like AI ethics and deep fakes and all of that,
Mhm.
so we're like, I don't know, it's a crazy time.
How did you talked about, being skeptical about different tools that come along, and I think it's more important now than ever for instructional designers to be wary of what's possible with tools or what they decide to bring into their instructional design practice. What was what made you make that decision, or how
Okay,
did you
I'll
decide to
tell
go
you
for that?
how
Yeah.
I found you.
Yeah.
So I think I was working at Harvard, and I've always been a fan of micro learning.
Mm,
So initially I found your product through 7 Taps, which I'm a
mm,
huge fan of. And I was using it because, like, for example, like information can be really dense in like a higher education institution, and faculty have so much on their plate and they have so much that they have to do for their job. So it's helpful to deliver guidance through short formats, because the last thing they want to do is like, they've already have to read all of these like journals, and they already have to grade papers, and there's so much obligation that you have as a faculty member, as as when you're an educator. So if you're going to help to train them on online pedagogy or digital accessibility, or any of these topics at all that we're talking about, micro learning is super helpful. In fact, I created a whole bunch of Synthesia videos in the last, or guest videos or cards or micro learning in the last couple of years. And then when I discovered the main program and all of the extra features that you have with the full program, I
mm,
was like
mm.
super excited, because many reasons. Like, for example, it's very similar to PowerPoint. You can import PowerPoint, you can select templates. And as a graphic designer trying to teach others design, like, templates are really
Ah,
helpful.
yes.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of like about accessibility too. Like, that's why my book is about graphic design and accessibility, because it's like, yeah, they're two different things, but they're also kind of similar. Because if you have extraneous stuff on your slide, like just like random clip art, or it's going to cause excessive cognitive load and be hard for you to like get the information that you're trying to, or to absorb it. Just like if
Mhm.
you have 5 or 6 different colors, or you have fonts that are unreadable, or if you have things that are moving too fast, or you have flashing, right? Or if you have the music up too high and there's talking at the same time, then you're going to have a hard time processing. Like all of this stuff is like UX and graphic design, right? But it's also like we also consider it like part of the accessibility conversation. And like, so I do appreciate that Synthesia has these templates, and it's like kind of guides people when you have templates so that
Hmm.
they don't make those mistakes as
Yeah.
often. It's like training wheels. I said, like, some people, some
Exactly.
graphic designers are very like against templates, like, oh, I'm so creative and unique and I do everything from scratch. And like, yeah, I do. I guess my point is like the templates make things so much easier. People don't have the time. They don't want to learn those programs. They don't want to invest in them. They're expensive. So all of these great tools that are out there are making our lives more proficient, more efficient, easier, faster, less error, and so forth.
Templates allow you to think of your focus more on the explanation and the communication of your idea, and then let the experts who have created these templates or these designs, let them help you figure out how to design visually that information.
All designers and all artists, the way that they got good was not like they didn't grow up like off the grid in the middle, like not like seeing any other art in their lives, right? They learn from seeing good art or seeing good graphic design or seeing good examples of e-learning. That's how we get better. We learn from others. Like, I
Mm.
can't take credit for my work 100% because it's like I learn from all the masters out there. I'm constantly learning. My LinkedIn feed is just like a source of learning every day. Like, I'm reading the most published learning science. I'm learning about how to improve gamification. I'm learning about different prompts for, chat GPT. I'm learning all the time. So what I think of templates is like, it's like training wheels. Like, we can use them at first, and then it'll teach you to recognize what is good design. And I talk about that in my book a lot. Like, when you start to recognize it, you can then tell the difference between bad design and good design. And the more you do that, the more you can be more confident in your skills and veer off of the template. So for example, say PowerPoint, right? We could take a template. It might be kind of boring. I could go into master slides and I could start editing things in there. And, oh, I'm going to be bold and I'm going to do these colors instead, or I'm going to use this font instead. And then you can start like kind of creating your own look and feel, your own personal style as a designer, but you learned from like what is considered aesthetically pleasing, or what the masters have created before you with those templates. So it's not that they're bad. We don't want to over rely on them, but they're a great learning tool. They're a way for us to like build and learn from and improve.
Yeah, if there was somebody who are listening to this and they wanted to start with accessibility in their e-learning today, what's, this, I don't know if it's the single most important aspect of designing e-learning with inclusivity and accessibility in mind, but where would be a starting place? What would you suggest for somebody who maybe has a gap between now and their next course and they can get started more with accessibility?
Yeah, I guess I would say like one of my biggest tips is like progress, not perfection. When we were talking before about misconceptions, one of the things I said is people think it's too overwhelming and like there's a lot of information. And especially when you go to like WCAG 2.2, the information that's presented to you can be very technical and it can feel like I don't even know where to start. So like I would say like if you read my book, I give some suggestions of like what I think are the top most important components of accessibility. So you're going to start somewhere. I think that those are things to consider. So I talk about like I don't know, color, color contrast. I talk about when you're using videos, because I know we're having a conversation about videos, that we're using captions and also transcripts, that our captions are accurate whenever possible. So if it's pre-recorded, that's easier to do. When you have live recording, you want to kind of ask your learners if they are okay with the auto captions, because they can be inaccurate. Some prefer you to have them on, and some would just rather read the transcript, or have also consider there's new things now, like for example, sign language implemented into videos. Like I'm super interested in that, and getting that involved as much as possible with video. So where else could you start, or some main things? Thinking about your learner and their learner variability, like finding out who they are, designing with them in mind, and asking them like what are their preferences, and trying to understand their lived experiences as much as possible, I think will help you design with more empathy. That's one of the biggest tips that I could say too, is get like into the context as much as possible. So like find out as much as you can from all stakeholders, and it will help you make decisions on making sure that your stuff is inclusive and also accessible.
Okay, well, with that, we'll take it. And thank you so much, Don, for stopping by. This is all extremely useful. It's so wonderful to talk to you. And I yeah, we'll chat soon. And thank you so much again.
Thank you. I appreciate coming on. It's always nice to chat with you.